we're actually deviating from our schedule. You were going to be hearing from Tim Murray, who's going to give an amazing talk on in-depth of how to use systrace. But before you hear that, you're going to hear from me, who's going to give a much less exciting and technical talk about new Android features important for games, or at least that's what it says in the schedule. That's actually going to be covered by this talk. But the truth is, what I realized is as I was coming up with this talk that most of you are not all that interested in new Android features. Because basically you're interested in targeting 90% of the devices out there, and the new Android features are going to be on a fairly small amount of them. So what I really should do is come back to you in like a year and be like, okay, here are the new Android features. And as soon as I can actually find my mouse pointer on one of these screens, there, it's there, it's there, it's there, it's there. That's incredible. Somewhere it thinks this monitor is hiding. Gotta love it. All right, there we are. Okay, good. That is where I thought it was. All right, so instead of actually talking about this, what I'm actually going to talk about is migrating your established game to target Android O and beyond. And why is this actually relevant to you? Well, I don't know how many people of you actually saw this, but back about 6 months ago, we announced that all apps and games on Google Play will have to target the latest SDK version of about a year ago in order to be able to continue updating on Play. And all new titles have to actually target SDK 26 or higher as of August if they want to be on Play at all. And you'll notice if you upload something today, you'll actually get a warning that looks like this that says exactly what I put here, so you don't have to read it. So the real question is, what does this actually mean? Okay, well, first of all, let's go over the real basics of what SDK versions are. The min SDK version is the lowest version your app is willing to support, and you usually tie this into this grid of what the latest devices platform distribution is like. The compile SDK is literally the headers and libraries that the app links against, and the target SDK version is this really important one, and this is the platform's way of ensuring backwards compatibility. And this really says to the world, I have tested my game on this platform release. And what happens is the system only applies certain kinds of behavior changes to target these specific SDK versions. And so technically, your compile SDK needs to be at least as great as your target SDK and min SDK, but usually, obviously, you're actually thinking about wanting to target a very large swath of the ecosystem, so you're actually going to make the compile SDK equal to the target SDK version, which is going to be much greater than the minimum SDK version. All right, that was probably confusing, but and it impacts a whole bunch of things. If you haven't gone beyond, let's say, M, you have to deal with changes in runtime permissions, alarm manager, manifest declared broadcast receivers, and background services. And you might be saying, okay, well, look, I'm using one of these. I don't care about this stuff at all. Okay, I mean, they're just going to handle all that for me, right? I mean, how is this relevant? You're talking about Android APIs to a bunch of game developers. And well, first of all, there's a possibility that you might have something else beyond that in your app. And these things might not be compatible with the latest version of Android. And so you have to look at all of these plugins and what they do and how they're impacting things. And of course, it's very possible you also have to update the version of the platform for one of those two big things, which can be a lot of work. So let's talk a little about runtime permissions. If you're still targeting L, which hopefully most of you aren't, this is something you'll have to deal with. And this is actually really good. I think runtime permissions is one of the best things we ever did because it allows you to ask for sensitive permissions in context. And not all permissions are runtime ones, just this really simple and easy to remember list. But the good news is that that's not the way the user sees it. Users actually see it like this. So calendar, phone, camera, sensors, contacts. I mean, none of you guys ever need any of this stuff, right? And of course, just because your game isn't yet targeting M, admittedly, this is not a game, but it's an example of something that doesn't yet target M. The user can still go on these devices and they can shut all that stuff off. So it's still good to actually understand how this works because, and you might be thinking, all right, well, this is easy. What I'm going to do is just prompt all of these things right up front, right when my game starts. I'll have like 5 permissions that I'm going to go ask for, and this is a really good way to make someone never run your game again. They're like, why does it want to have access to my contacts right now? That makes no sense. That's really scary. Go away. So if it only needs the camera permission when it's actually doing some cool stuff with AR mode, then ask for the camera permission then, okay? It's really, really important. I know there's some work involved here, but it's so important when someone's getting the first impression of your game. The first thing they see is like, I want to know all about you and everything you do. So another thing that is going to change is alarms. And alarms are actually one of my favorite APIs because it's just hilarious. Now they take 2 different forms. They have literal alarms, and we have schedulers for background work. And this was originally really how you did background work on Android. In early versions of it, you would schedule an alarm, and you would wake up your app in the future. And what we decided was that was a bad thing because a lot of apps are all waking up at the same time or even waking up at various times, and it wasn't allowing us to prioritize system resources well. So back in KitKat, we decided, okay, we're going to make it so that alarms by default are not exact unless they're explicitly requested. And this is all stuff that only happens if your target SDK version changes. So when we added this thing called, well, set means that it will happen around the time that you said it would happen, and then we have set exact, which means it's really going to happen at that time that you really said it was going to happen. So this is how APIs evolve. The thing is that this is actually code from the support library. So if you're using the support library, you don't have to care about this. You call set exact. On older versions, it calls set. On newer versions, it calls set exact, and it works the same way. Now, the alarm manager then, we had more changes, and we went to does. Which had happened in Android M along with runtime permissions. And we realized, oh, well, now we've got this problem that the device could be asleep. And we're only allowing apps to run during these maintenance windows during that time. So we decided, well, set exact isn't good enough because set exact still isn't going to fire during these maintenance windows. And we now added set exact and allow while idle. Just to be really explicit, we like long function names. It's very self-documenting. And these actually can wake the device from doze. And again, here's what the compatibility story looks like here. And once again, there we are. And it actually just calls into the previous function we just showed you if you're on older versions. So very, 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 very simple. And yes, this allows you to fire in the middle of doze. You might not want to do this because it's pretty bad for battery life, but it does give you a way of doing it. So after all of this, if you're going to be running a bunch of work in the background, probably don't use alarms at all. Actually, consider using something like, well, actually, yeah, probably Firebase Job Dispatcher at this point, although we've got some news coming tomorrow, so stay tuned. So broadcast receivers also changed, and these have been used by the platform to notify apps in response to system-wide events. And what a lot of apps used to do was they used to hang around and they used to say, oh, I want to wait for Wi-Fi so I can download a whole bunch of stuff in the background and not actually impact the data of the user all that much, which is good because users, when they see an app using tons of data, they'll uninstall it. So we have like 10 apps all fire at once as soon as the device got on Wi-Fi. Like you'd plug the device in, and the device would heat up, and it's a really bad user experience, honestly. And whatever they're doing in the foreground gets completely trashed. So we decided this is a bad thing. So we said, all right, this is one of these things that gave developers great power, and with great power, comes great responsibility. And in response to the way these endpoints were used, we took all the power away. So you can't actually launch the app anymore when network changes happen. However, we did actually, at least once you target O. Now, the good news is, first of all, some of these broadcasts other than network actually still work because there's simply no other way to do it. So like if the locale changes, a bunch of people are like, really? There's a broadcast for when locale changes? That's cool. But yes, when locale changes, you can, or accessories are attached. A lot of these things are just the kind of things that doesn't happen very often. Boot completed, you can still use. So if you need to have alarms or the things that you have to register during that still works. But for the most part, these don't work anymore. So for network broadcast, however, you can use Job Scheduler, Firebase Job Dispatcher, or some other things. And that allows you to actually say, hey, I want to make sure that my job gets run when I actually have network. This is cool. You can be downloading new stuff in the background. This is what hopefully all of your SDKs are using that are doing things like ads. If they're not using this, they're not going to work really well when you go and target Android O. And this is cool. You can actually set all sorts of information about the network type, for example, here. So you can actually say, hey, I want to only have this running when I actually have network, which is cool. So it can actually let you know that there is a network available. And more importantly, it can also say, I only want to run on unmetered networks, which is kind of a cool thing. So you can say, hey, and you can even do cool stuff like I want to run on unmetered networks, but I want to have a watchdog that hangs around and says if my job hasn't run within 24 hours, let's run it anyways, that kind of thing. So you have a lot of options here. And if you do have to use something for backwards compatibility for an old version of Android, like have some connectivity change thing, one of the things that's really cool is you can actually leave it disabled by default. Which is cool. I didn't even know you could do this in early versions of Android. I'm like, oh, that's awesome, but it's been always there. And you can actually then turn it back on. So you can say, OK, well, now I'm on this ancient version of Android. Let's turn this back on. That'll allow me to still be launched on an old version and still use the old APIs. Another thing that people want to know about is when their package gets uninstalled and reinstalled with a new version. That's actually kind of a useful thing. And a lot of them would go and say, let's look to see all of the packages on the system. And when that happens, and that's really bad, a lot of apps were actually doing that, and so you can no longer do that. But you can actually use my package replaced to find out when your own specific package gets replaced, which is good. There's also actually an API if you do want to find out when other packages are replaced on a regular basis. You can actually pull for them with a sequence number. So you can say, oh, has anything happened since the last time I run? So if you have other apps that you're trying to check to see that are companions or to the one you have, or just want to check to see how that's going on in the system, you can still do that without actually having to have your app wake up every time another app is installed. It's much better. OK, so let's talk about background limits as well. This is also something that has changed with Android O. Probably the biggest change is that when you're in the background, you can't do a whole bunch of things. Like you can't launch services anymore. And this is a big change for a lot of these SDKs that just kind of assumed, oh, I could always do this. And so what does it really mean to be in the foreground? Well, it means your app is visible. It means it has a foreground service. Foreground service is that service that actually has a notification associated with it all the time, so the user knows that it's always running. Sometimes it may kind of annoyingly show up as this thing that's running in your notification list, but it's really important that it's visible to the user. Your app is essentially in the foreground at that point, or if it's bound to an app that's in the foreground. It also, if you're doing one of these things, which I don't think any game developers are using, except maybe a wallpaper service, you're also in the foreground. You're in the background when you're not visible, and when you're not running a foreground service, and if you're running one of these job things or broadcast receiver. So, and if you're running on O+, starting a service in the background throws an illegal state exception if you're targeting O. So this is a pretty big deal. This actually affected some of my code. This really changed the way Android dealt with running stuff in the background in a really good way for users, and a way that makes things slightly more challenging for developers. So you can still start services that are running in the background when your game is in the foreground, and those will continue to run for about a minute after your game is exited. And it doesn't mean that your code stops running. Remember, Android, these are hints to the OS for how to schedule things more than anything else. So it doesn't mean that your app immediately gets closed after it gets backgrounded, that your code stops. What it does mean, however, on Android O is that you'll actually lose your wake locks. And this happens for everyone. So once your app no longer has a running service on Android O, your wake locks will automatically be cut off. If you don't have an activity or a service or a broadcast receiver or a content provider running, your wake locks get cut off. And that's actually a good thing. We had a lot of apps that were just hanging around all the time and keeping wake locks open and wasting a lot of battery. And so this is actually something that affects you on O regardless of whether or not you're actually targeting O. But on earlier versions, you can keep a service running all the time. And on O, you can't. And there are still a few cases where you can actually still launch background services. So you can actually do this when your app is responding to a notification. That the system still thinks of your app as being foregrounded, so that's kind of good. High priority Firebase Cloud Message also is considered being in the foreground, and that also wakes you up from doze. So don't use it very often unless you have to, like really important timely things. And SMS and MMS delivery, which hopefully no one here is going to be that provider. And then we also have behavior changes. And you might not have noticed these yet, depending on how many of your users are actually running Oreo. but we have a lot of limits on background location, so which are good. This actually is important. A lot of apps are just hanging around all the time, like, where are my users? And so you can't do that anymore. You get much less, even if you request tons and tons of location updates. If your app is running in the background, it does not have a foreground service, then you only get a couple of results an hour by comparison. It's actually a lot more than that, but it's a lot less than it was. Even Wi-Fi scans are actually cached. So if you keep scanning Wi-Fi over and over in the background, it's only going to give you a few updates every hour by comparison to what it was doing before. So use things like geofencing. For example, if you need to know when the user reaches a specific location, you can do things like you only have 100 of those. You can use things like dynamic geofencing with regions. These are all really cool things. If you want to do cool stuff with your game, if you want to have like hardware beacons in places, that's pretty cool too. That's another way using the nearby APIs. There's a lot of ways to get around that. Use batching if you want to track people's location. Hopefully a lot of games aren't doing this, but location-based games are getting more popular all the time. So you can just check this max wait time here, and that will allow you to batch up location updates for you. And then you can also use passive location. So this fastest interval here actually will mean that, okay, yes, I'm not requesting getting updated all the time with location, but if someone else is using Google Maps or using activity tracking and somehow for sports or something like that, that I still get those updates too. So it's kind of a cool way of doing that. So another thing I wanted to mention is that Android keeps introducing battery optimizations that are based on deferring and restricting background tasks. So again, I talked a little bit about doze. This limits app activity to maintenance windows when things are unplugged or stationary, that kind of thing. And then we actually added doze on the go. I guess that's not really what we're calling it. It's doze light, but it's for when it still limits most things to maintenance windows when the device is unplugged and the screen is off, like when the user's in the pockets. It does allow for a few things that aren't allowed during regular doze. And then we also did this thing called app standby. So if someone doesn't use an app very often, it starts slowly limiting what the app can do. And that's really good because a lot of, I install apps that I only use when I'm in certain places, and this allows me to make sure that they're not constantly draining my battery. But for a game developer, it does mean that if someone's not using your app all the time and you're trying to do all sorts of stuff in the background, they'll stop seeing these things. And then stay tuned. We have a lot more stuff coming in P that we'll be talking about tomorrow. So how do you test these things? It's pretty straightforward. You can test doze this way using an ADB command. You can see how, and this allows you to see how your app actually performs when it's running in doze mode. You can test app standby by doing this. You have to unplug the battery, but you can do that with this nice command that makes the system thinks the battery is unplugged before you start doing that. Okay, and I did mention that I was going to talk about kind of modern features you could take advantage of. One of the things you have to take advantage of is notification channels, because if you don't have notification channels and you're targeting O, your notifications don't appear. They just don't show up, so you really want to turn this on. And this is actually really cool, because if you actually give the user good channels and explain, like, this is a really high priority notification, and these are things you might be interested in these categories, it prevents them from actually disabling all notifications for your game. And so this is actually something I definitely recommend really thinking about and trying to make a user scenario where they're like, okay, well, actually, I really do want to know when there's a cool free offer here, but I don't want to be notified every single time that one of my friends comes on, that sort of thing. And so you can really make the user make good choices that say, you know what, I don't want to disable all the notifications for your app because the app means something to me, but I can actually use these channels. So I recommend really thinking about this. It actually has helped us too. We've actually seen in devices that have notification channels, we actually see less people turning off all notifications. So it does actually work. One of the things you also have to think about is if your app is using immersive mode, or some games actually do use this translucent status bar, which is kind of cool. I wish more did. You have to think about this display cutout because a lot of apps and games assumed that the status bar was like 28 pixels tall, 28 density independent pixels tall, and turns out it's not true if you have these cutouts. And you can also simulate a cutout using the P-developer preview image. So that's useful. Probably not a lot of things. Make sure, probably the biggest thing for game developers actually that some games aren't still doing is dealing well with long aspect ratio screens. So this has gotten a lot better recently. I can't imagine why. But I guess long aspect ratio screens are getting more common. But there's still games that will occasionally have content that's cut off because a lot of people really think of things in terms of the layout of their HUD in terms of having a fairly limited set of aspect ratios. So this is something that's definitely worth testing for, and these are going to be even more common this year. You can letterbox things if you want. Another thing I haven't seen any games doing, but I'm sort of waiting for it, is actually supporting picture-in-picture. Obviously, people use it for chat, but I'm sort of waiting for some, especially, honestly, I want Pokemon Go to do this, because it'd be kind of awesome to have like my little Pokemon character running around in the corner while I'm doing other things. So I put it there. Also, we do have Vulkan. Think of taking advantage of it. These are the new changes that are in Vulkan 1.1, which is actually part of Android P, which we're finally implementing multi-view, which I'm really excited about. For VR, we also have the memory models that are necessary to have much better compatibility with HLSL shaders, which is cool for people who are sharing those, as well as some cool things for video processing and for OpenCLC compatibility. So again, there's a lot of cool stuff there. So consider using Vulkan. Another thing that I really, really like, and this isn't part of P, this was actually added in Android O, is A-Audio, which is our new audio API. It's really straightforward to use, like really simple by comparison to using OpenSL. And the best part about it is we actually have this library called Oboe that wraps A-Audio and wraps OpenSL, uses one API. With A-Audio, you also can get access to something called sharing mode exclusive, which actually gives you super, super, super low latency. So it's really for like hardcore rhythm games. It gets you down to sub 10 millisecond output on devices that support it, at least our devices. It's pretty cool. I definitely recommend taking a look at Oboe. Here's a project you can go to. Oh yeah, and there's one more thing that we did in Android P that I wanted to make sure that you knew about, and that is that we actually got rid of the ability to call most private APIs. Now, if you've been following us, we actually, in the NDK, we stopped people from calling most private APIs in Android O. In Android P, we actually stopped people from calling most of the APIs that are running in the kind of native sort of Java level. And there actually are quite a few that are still allowed. We're in the process of trying to go through the SDK, make sure that all the things that are really useful are actually and relevant and not scary are turned into proper APIs, and so that we're trying really hard not to actually hurt people's functionality with this. But what I want everyone to do is test your game on the developer preview too. Because if your game doesn't work on that, it might be because one of these APIs is no longer allowed, and it could be one of the libraries that you're bundling, and one of the plugins you're bundling, one of the SDKs that you're bundling along with it that's causing it. So I highly, highly recommend testing on DP2. With DP1, we would throw up a toast when these things happen. With DP2, it'll get logged in Logcat, and the app will crash. And what will happen in the release version is probably something in between. So I'm not guaranteeing, not just because something crashes in DP2 doesn't mean it's going to crash. So if you have a problem with it and you're saying, hey, this middleware doesn't work, report it to us, file an issue, and we might not actually make that crash in the final version. But if no one files these issues, it's likely to go out as it is. So this is just something you should know. Please, 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 please test against Developer Preview 2. It'll be coming out very shortly. You can also use this strict mode VM policy to actually detect whether your app is doing any non-SDK usage. So this is great even if you don't have the source code for a bunch of the plugins. You can run this. This will work on Android P Preview 2. And this will allow you to actually see, OK, does my game actually do this even though I don't really realize it is? We also have this site we've put up on DAC to help you transform your app or game to the new Target SDK rules. It's a pretty good thing. It's a pretty good thing to check out. We've spent some time on it. So hopefully most of the information I shared here is review for you. Hopefully most of you are already targeting relatively recent SDK versions. But if you haven't, this should hopefully help. And that's it for me. So I hope this was informative, and thank you very much. And I've got a couple minutes for questions, yeah, if we could get the mic over. Yes?
One thing to add for the Target SDK version is also the 64-bit in 2019.
Yes, so I'm actually going to have, so this is another really important thing. I'm going to have my colleague Dan, who's going to come later, who's from the NDK team, is going to talk about this, is that this year it's targeting P, it's targeting O. Next year it'll be targeting P and targeting every app that has a native component will have to have a 64-bit binary shipped alongside any other binaries you want to ship. So you could, if you want to just ship 64-bit, you can do that, but it's something that's been needed to happen a lot of, in the future is 64-bit.
And then the other question I had was about notification channels.
Yes.
Are we going to see a way to actually prompt those categories within the actual notification system OS, within the app itself, as opposed to directing users to settings to customize those?
That's a good question. I don't think so, not yet. But I know that they are they're going to talk a little bit about notifications, how they're revamping this, the notification channel stuff tomorrow. So I definitely recommend watching the a little bit on that in the What's New in Android talk. Anything else? Yes. I can repeat the question too. Which a link? Oh, sorry. Actually, this one got recorded too, so we'll have that up. We'll have that up later soon, hopefully. So, but also, I'm giving a version of this talk which is slightly less focused on game developers at I/O on Thursday. So there'll be a live stream to that, and that will actually probably get even faster than this one. It'll have a few other. It'll have a bunch of corny jokes. And it will have a few other things that I can't talk about now. So it might be worth you checking out as well, the I/O presentation.